Welcome to our first video on probability. So we can really begin by kind of asking ourselves, what is probability really? Well, the answer might be that it's a measure of how likely an outcome is to occur. So one thing about probability is when we say that it's a measure, it's always going to take on value between 0 and 1. So when probabilities are really close to 0, it means that the outcome is really not likely to happen. On the flip side, if the outcome is really close to 1, if the probability is really close to 1, then the outcome is actually very likely to happen. So in probability, we talk about things like sample spaces. Now, a sample space is really just the set of all possible outcomes that we can have for an experiment. And so if we take the example of flipping a coin one time, well, the outcome that we can have is either that we get a heads or that we get tails. Now, an event is really just a set of some possible outcomes that we can have in our sample space. And so, kind of taking another example, suppose that we roll a pair of dice. Now, for that fair six-sided die, we're assuming that we can just have the numbers 1 through 6 for each one of them. And so if we look at our sample space, we could have the outcomes like 1, 1, or 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, all the way up to 6, 6 for our possible outcomes. And so an event that we might talk about in that sample space would be when the sum is going to be 7 for the dice that we roll. And so if we look at the outcomes that actually correspond to that, then they would be whether we get a 1 on the first die, a 6 on the second, a 2 on the first die, and then a 5 on the second, a 3 and a 4, or a 4 and a 3, a 5 and a 2, or a 6 and a 1. Now, one thing about probability that we need to talk about that might be a little bit new is this idea of notation. And when we talk about notation, we're just saying, how do we actually write down the symbols whenever we're talking about probability? And so we might come along and see the phrase, the probability of an event. Now that's written out in English. But now how might we write that in math symbols? Well, we have prob, and that's going to be short for probability, and then E, we put the E in parentheses, and we read that as of E. And so whatever the thing is on the outside, prob of E. And that's how we'll really kind of condense this phrase, probability of E, down into just a few symbols, prob of E. So from that previous example, we might ask, what is the probability of rolling a 7? Well, our notation for that would have our prob, and then inside the parentheses, we would have however we characterize the event. And so in this case, we might just say rolling 7. So the prob and the parentheses rolling 7, we would actually say that in our mind as, or we would be thinking of the words that go along with those symbols as prob of 7. So the probability of rolling a 7 is how we would translate that set of symbols. And so what is the probability going to be? It's going to be the fraction where we have the numerator is the number of ways that the event can occur. The denominator is going to be the number of possible outcomes that we can have in our sample space, so our size of our sample space. And so in this particular case, how many ways can we get a 7? Well, we had 6 different ways of doing that. 1, 6, 2, 5, 3, 4, 4, 3, 5, 2, and 6, 1. So we had 6 different ways of rolling a 7 out of 36 different possibilities in our sample space, and so our probability is just 6 over 36. Now, usually we'll write our answers with probability as either just being fractions. Sometimes we'll simplify the fractions, sometimes we won't simplify the fractions. Decimals, we can write them as decimals, or we can write them as even percents. And so we might say that the probability of rolling a 7 is going to be equal to 6 over 36, or 1 over 6. And as a decimal, that might be equal to 0.166666 repeating, or if we want to convert that to a percent, 16.66666 repeating percent. Now, probability kind of comes in two different flavors. So the first of them might be the empirical probability. The second would be the theoretical probability. Now, empirical probability is calculated from experiments. The theoretical probability, on the other hand, is calculated from a particular mathematical model that you put together. And so examples of each one of those, if I go and perform the experiment of flipping a coin 500 times and I get 246 tails, well, my empirical probability of tails is going to be 246 over 500, or 0.492. On the other hand, if I just say, well, a coin has one of two possibilities. It's either going to land on heads or it's going to land on tails. In that case, my theoretical probability is going to be, probability of tails is going to be 1 over 2, or 0.5. Now, one thing that we encounter in mathematics is something called the law of large numbers. And so in probability and statistics, what that means is that the more times that we do an experiment, then the closer the empirical probabilities are going to get to whatever the theoretical probabilities are. And so from that last example, when we had 246 tails out of 500 heads, our empirical probability was 0.492. That was very close to our theoretical probability of 0.5. Not exactly, but if we turned around and flipped the coin maybe 1,000 times, we might get even closer to that 0.5. So let's look at an example where we are going to spin the spinner, and in each quadrant of the circle we've got a different number. So we've got 1, 4, 5, and 8 in there. We're going to spin this spinner 2 times and take each digit that it lands on and make a 2-digit number out of that. So we can ask, well, what is our sample space in that case? Well, for the first number, we could get a 1, we could get a 4, a 5, or a 1 for the second number. We could also get a 1, 4, 5, or 8. And so our sample space kind of looks like 1, 1, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 8, 4, 1, 4, 4, 4, 5, 4, 8, 5, 1, 5, 4, 5, 5, and 5, 8, or 8, 1, 8, 4, 8, 5, and 8, 8. And so we can say the event that we might be interested in would be the event in which the number that we get is going to be divisible by 11. Now our sample space really contains 4 different possibilities for E, for our event E. And that could be either we get an 11, a 44, a 55, or an 88. And so we might say that the probability of E is going to be equal to 4 over 16. We've got a total of 16 things in our sample space. So 4 over 16 simplifies to the fraction 1/4, and that's going to be equal to the decimal 0.25. So one place where probability and statistics has found application has been in the world of biology, and in particular genetics. That if we kind of look at the father of modern genetics, as sometimes he's referred to, Gregor Mendel, he was actually an Augustinian friar who lived around 1822 to 1844. Now, he's most notable for applying these proportions, these probabilities as we might call them, to traits and offspring of pea plants. Now, he's the first one who actually coined the terms that we are probably familiar with today in talking about dominant and recessive traits. So, suppose an example of that might be the trait of being tall as being dominant over being short. So a plant is actually going to have two genes, which it will pass off one of those genes to its offspring. And one of those genes could be the gene to make the plant tall. Another gene could be the plant to make the plant short. So let's say that we denote with a capital T, the gene that makes a plant tall, and little t for the gene that makes the plant short. Now, a plant's going to have two different genes, and so if we talk about a purebred tall plant, then both of those genes are going to be capital T's. So we have capital T, capital T. Plants with only one tall and one short, so it's got a capital T and a lowercase gene, lowercase t, are called carriers of the gene, of the short gene. And plants which actually are short have both genes as being short genes. So plants with one tall and one short actually look tall, but plants that have both short do end up being short. So when we cross plants of one type with plants of another, what we can do is construct a table of possible outcomes for those things. So one parent, if they're both carriers, for instance, one parent is going to have a capital T and a lowercase t. Another parent is going to have, the other parent's also going to have a capital T and a lowercase t. So we draw this square and we divide that square into 4 parts. For each across the top, we'll have one gene from one parent, and across the left-hand side, we'll have one gene from each of the second parent. Now, what goes in the box is actually the gene from the top and the gene from the left. Okay, that would correspond where they would meet in that box. So in the top left box, we're going to have a capital T, so we have TT. In the top right box, we've got a capital T on top, a little t for the column, so that's going to give us a capital T, little t. Same thing for the lower left. We're going to have a capital T and a lowercase t, and for the lower right, we've got 2 lowercase t's. So for that one, we'll have a little t and a little t. So in using this particular model, we've really got 4 possible outcomes. And of those 4 possible outcomes, one of them will be a purebred tall plant, 2 of them will be carriers, and 1 of them will be a short plant. And so we might say that the probability from this particular model, the probability of being a purebred tall plant is going to be 1/4 or 0.25. The probability that the offspring will be a carrier is 1/2, so 0.5. Having 2 out of 4, and the probability of getting a short plant would be 1 out of 4, or again 0.25. Now, kind of again using that same model, what if we crossed a purebred tall plant with a purebred short, with just a short plant? So for the short plant, we've got 2 lowercase t's, so those go across the top. For the purebred tall plant, we've got 2 capital T's, so we've got 2 capital T's over on the left. And if we construct our square, then every entry in our square is going to have a capital T and a lowercase t. Now, what we conclude from this model is that all of our plants will be tall, but will be carriers of the short gene. And so if we look at the probabilities from this particular model, it would be that the probability that it's a purely tall plant is going to be 0/4, or 0. The probability that it's a carrier will be 4/4, which is 1. And the probability that it will be a short plant will be 0/4 again, or 0. So this has been a little bit of a look at the beginnings of probability, how we compute things, and maybe an application that we might see from biology. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.